Tēnā koto katoa and hello everybody. Welcome to the Lentil Intervention podcast. My name is Ben Adelberg and I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Tēnei ka mihi ke te mana whenua o Aotearoa, and we acknowledge the local tribal authorities of New Zealand.
And g'day, I'm Emma Spratt and I'm currently coming to you from Durrumble country in Queensland. Before we dive into our conversation today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community.
The Lentil Intervention is an Australasian educational and advocacy platform dedicated to raising awareness about the current climate and health crisis.
And on this podcast, we invite guests to chat about topics that will inspire you to take action to improve your own health and the health of the planet.
So please subscribe to and share this podcast and visit our website for the full show notes.
And don't forget to buy us a coffee if you'd like to support our work.
Is climate an emergency? Is net zero 2050 actually achievable? Can we continue to operate status quo by simply offsetting our carbon emissions? This and much more we've been wanting to cover for a while, not just because it's very topical, but because we need to expose the reality of it all.
Yeah, so today we're chatting with David Spratt, a climate policy and science analyst who's been serving as the research coordinator for the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration since 2014. David was co-founder of the Climate Action Centre in Melbourne and co-author of the popular book Climate Code Red, The Case for Emergency Action. David, we know you're an incredibly busy man, so we really appreciate you joining us today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
David, let's start off, before we dig straight into it, let's learn a little bit about yourself first. Tell us a little bit about who you are and your background.
Funnily enough, both my parents were science teachers and they told me I could do anything in life except become a science teacher. So I went and did other things. I went and studied economics and hated it because it was a bullshit science. I mean, economics is a fraud, and spent a whole lot of work, half a working life in producing books and publications and writing and so on, and then sort of cycled back to the climate issue, I guess almost 20 years ago, when I assumed that all these environmental climate NGOs, advocacy organisations were doing good work on my behalf. And then a report came out from Sir Nicholas Stern in the UK, who was an economist who did this very famous report. And he said, "Oh, look, we should try and hold warming to 2 degrees, but I think that would be too economically disruptive. So maybe we'll go for 3 degrees." And I knew enough to know that 3 degrees is the end of everything we care about. And then various climate sort of well-funded NGOs came out and said, "This is a fabulous step forward, Sir Nicholas Stern's report." And I went, "No, this is not right." And that's what actually motivated me to start and to understand that there was a conversation and an understanding about climate change, climate impacts, and where we had to go that was different from that was predominant in the mainstream.
And speaking of publications, you're a bit of a prolific writer. Your book with Philip Sutton, Climate Code Red, that came out in 2008. So in terms of science, I suppose one could argue that it could be getting a bit long in the tooth, but some of what you actually wrote about, we're now actually seeing play out in real time. So still a very relevant read, potentially even more so now to do with the parts where you're discussing not doing business as usual and actually doing something. But something you explained really well in the book, and maybe we can just start with the basics here for the listeners. Can you explain what the concepts mean, feedback loops, positive feedback loops, and tipping points? And do you think we've actually reached any yet?
Yes, we have. So a feedback is where a system makes itself worse. For example, in the Arctic Ocean, most of the Arctic Ocean is apart from Greenland, which has got these glaciers which are 2 kilometres high. The actual ocean itself is covered in a very thin crust of ice called sea ice, which is 1 to 3 metres thick, and it fluxes between summer and winter. But when you start to get a warmer climate, the amount of ice decreases. And then in summer, particularly northern summer, where you've got the sun up there 24 hours a day at the pole, Instead of the sun's heat reflecting off white ice, it's being absorbed by a dark coloured sea. And that sea absorbs more heat, and that produces more melting. So that's an example of a system actually reproducing itself. So that's a feedback. Another one, for example, is we have large amounts of carbon stored in the ground in what's called permafrost, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, ground that's permanently frozen. I mean, you could call it frozen coal if you want to, but it's very, very dense with coal, with carbon. As the permafrost becomes warmer, that will start to melt. As that melts, it produces carbon dioxide and methane going to the atmosphere. Now, more methane goes into the atmosphere, more carbon dioxide goes in the atmosphere. The place gets warmer, more permafrost melts. So that's another one. So that's the idea of a self-reproducing system. The idea of a tipping point is where something has reached a point of instability that it will transition to a different phase. And perhaps the best example, if you've got an ice block in the fridge, it's frozen. If you take it out of the fridge and put it on the table, it's still frozen, but it will melt with nothing else happening. So as soon as you take it out of the fridge, it's reached a tipping point, and you know it's going to end up in a different state. So, I mean, for those who are systems theorists, a system will be an ecosystem, a part of a climate system, whether it's ice sheets or permafrost, can be stable within a certain range of conditions, within certain temperatures. And then once they get past that temperature, they will evolve to a quite different, discretely different state. Once those processes are triggered, they're very hard to stop. So once the ice block is out of the fridge, there's nothing you can do to stop it melting except putting it back in. So that's a tipping point.
And I know there's a number that have been discussed. You know, we've got Antarctica, the Arctic, potentially areas of the Amazon flipping to being carbon emitting rather than a carbon sink. What ones do you see as most at risk at the moment, or ones that have already reached their thresholds?
Yeah, well, we did a little report called Climate Dominoes. I mean, that's Climate Dominoes, another way is talking about a tipping point early this year, which is on the Breakthrough website. And I mean, I guess this is important because the whole climate policy making framework and the whole goal from the beginning is if we can hold warming to 2 degrees, to no more than 2 degrees, everything will be okay. And for example, in the early reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the process of international scientists reporting every few years on the science, in the early reports, they said, we think the Antarctic will be stable for the next 1,000 years. This is like 15 years ago. Now we have peer-reviewed, really credible science. In fact, the first one came out in 2014 saying some of those Antarctic glaciers are already past their tipping points. And last year, in December, there was an incredible paper came out which the media talked about being the Doomsday Glacier, saying we think this really important glacier in West Antarctica will the part of it that's really holding it stable will crumble within the next 5 years. So it's really clear that there are some elements of the climate system for the current temperature, which is 1.2 degrees, are already past their tipping points. I mean, it is certainly true for West Antarctica. There's no evidence that it's true for the Greenland ice sheet. It's certainly true for coral reefs. In Australia, we know for corals, corals are in the death cycle of being bleached by marine heat waves so often that they take 10 years to recover, but they get bleached every 2 or 3 years, then that's a bad outcome. There's also evidence that parts of the eastern Amazon are now becoming a net source of carbon. That is, with less rain, with warmer temperature, rather than trees absorbing carbon, which is their great glory, it's actually producing more carbon than it's absorbing. So there's some of the systems at 1.2 degrees. And of course, that leads to a really obvious conclusion that nobody in the international policy making process wants to say, which is the current temperature is already dangerous. 1.2 degrees we've got now is already dangerous. I mean, if those ice sheets are melting, and we know from the long-term climate history, going back millions of years, that in the long run, and this can take some time, in the long run, each 1 degree of warming will produce a sea level rise of 10 to 20 metres. So if we've got 1 degree of warming and we stayed around a few thousand years, we could expect sea levels to be 10 metres to 20 metres higher than they are now. And that's dangerous because we've got a civilization that's largely built on the coast. I mean, most of the population lives on the coast. A lot of others farm alluvial deltas. I mean, the richest food growing areas in the world are alluvial deltas, which are 1/2 to 2 metres above sea level rise. So, I mean, I think the lesson out of all of this is that climate change is already dangerous, and the agreed upon target of 2 degrees is I mean, the great American climate scientist, James Hansen, who was head of NASA climate science for many years, called 2 degrees a recipe for disaster. 20 years ago, he said, we are on the edge of a precipice beyond which there is no redemption. And I think that's right. And he was the person that inspired us to write Climate Code Red, because he was telling a very different story from, the media and politicians' story.
Is it fair to say that the accuracy of modelling and predictions, say 15, 20 years ago, were too conservative, or were they influenced by politics in terms of what has actually been communicated to the rest of the world?
Look, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, climate science as a science didn't exist 50 years ago. I mean, you've got a physical system that's evolving rapidly. I mean, it's like science trying to catch up with COVID. I mean, the science is going to play catch up with something that's running away from you. I mean, climate change is a bit like that. It's evolving quickly. The science is developing quickly. We know so much more than we did. So that's always a problem. Science always lags behind reality. When reality changes more quickly, it's more problematic. Science is also conservative in the sense that, the scientific method is that you don't say anything unless you can prove it and you can reproduce your results. So there's been a debate, apart from peer-reviewed science, having another form of science where you say to leading scientists, what do you think's going on? And they will say something different from what they can prove with data and models. So I think, that's the nature of the scientific method. But then you get to a politics as well in two ways. First of all, scientists and science funding want to be relevant to the policy making process. So if you say things are too outrageous, and it's happened, people get defunded. There was a great scientist 50 years ago called John Mercer, who was mercurial, and he was a glaciologist, and he said, this was in the mid-1970s, he said, I can see within 50 years the disintegration of the Antarctic ice sheet. And he wrote a peer-reviewed paper about it, and everybody dismissed him. And in fact, James Hansen termed a phrase called the Mercer effect, which was losing your funding by pushing too hard, which many scientists have experienced. And in fact, what John Mercer said 50 years ago is absolutely what's happened. And what everybody else said, that Antarctica would be stable for 1,000 years, is wrong. So there's that problem as well. And then when you come to those assessment reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC itself is 190 countries in a UN process where the highest decisions are made by 190 diplomats. So diplomats sit around and they select the lead authors, and that's a conservative process. And when it comes not to the big science reports, but what they call the summaries for policymakers, which is little short condensation of these big reports which come out, those political representatives go through and vote on those reports sentence by sentence. So the climate ambassador for Saudi Arabia or Russia or Australia, whoever, can just knock out stuff that they don't like. So this is the complicated dance between science and politics.
And I mean, you've already highlighted a number of potential issues here, but the IPCC reports, they put forward a number of potential modelling scenarios, and it's dependent on policy implementation. Of course, with any mathematical modelling of a dynamic system, there's going to be inherent uncertainties. But these reports, conservative as they are what most people put a lot of weight into, and then that shapes their policy. So out of the potential models at the moment, potential scenarios, what do you see as realistic as actually playing out?
Well, I mean, this is an amazingly complex and wonderful field that we could talk about for several hours about mathematics and models and their limitations. Because the first thing about a model is that it's numbers that can be processed, that can be digitized. So if you have processes that can't be turned into numbers and connected together, they don't work. So that's the first problem, because in the climate system, we have all sorts of things that we know quite well. You put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it gets warmer. Every 1 degree of warming means that the atmosphere will hold 7% more water vapor. So as it gets warmer, you can get more intense rainfall because there's more water vapor up there. And so on. Those are what we call, linear processes, a relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature, between temperature and the amount of water vapor. Then there are other things which are really non-linear, where you don't know when they're going to happen. And they're the really big things, where processes, the Antarctic ice sheets are inherently stable until they get to that point where it cracks, and then a whole lot can change very quickly. And that's not a linear process. That's a non-linear process. And you can't model non-linear processes. You need other ways of trying to think about it. So models are trying to deal with a system, as you say, which has inherent uncertainty in it. So there's certain things they can't do. And if you rely on those models, you're going to get an underestimation of what's likely to happen. So that's one problem, if that makes sense. The second problem is for anybody who does any science or statistics or anything, you'll always say, look, there's a range of outcomes. It's what's called a probability distribution, which looks a bit like an upside down U curve, where they say, well, the most likely things are the things in the middle of the probability distribution. We have this amount of carbon in the atmosphere, then the temperature could be 1.5 to 2.5, but we'll say 2 because that's the middle. So it's based on probabilities. What's the most probable thing that happens? But as scientists have pointed out, and we wrote about in a report called What Lies Beneath, when the risks are so big that they could bring human civilization to an end, which is what we're talking about, existential risks, you shouldn't focus on the middle of the range outcome. You should focus on the high-end possibilities. So, and John Schellenhuber, the great European scientist who headed the Potsdam Institute for 20 years, advisor to Angela Merkel, advisor to the Pope, wrote a great forward-to report we did, and he said, we should focus on the possibilities, not the probabilities. So that's not in the center of the distribution. But the question is this, and it's a bit like nuclear weapons. It's the same questions that generals ask in war. Not what might happen, but what is the worst thing that could feasibly happen, and how do we stop it? I mean, that's the attitude we've taken with nuclear weapons. What's the worst thing that could happen, and how do we stop it? But with climate change, we're not doing that.
So what's considered acceptable risk and, risk of failure in these models then?
Well, here's the thing. And this is the core issue. So there are these things, mythical things called carbon budgets, which scientists produce with models which underestimate the risks, which say, if we want to hold warming to 2 degrees, we think we can burn this much more carbon. It's like somebody going on a diet and then putting bars of chocolate in front of them. It's a really dumb idea, because if you tell somebody they've got a budget, they'll spend it. But that's not the way it is. I mean, let me give you an example. They will say, and they use a 50%, they say for holding warming to 2 degrees with a 50% chance. So what they're saying is if this carbon budget, there's 50% chance that it won't warm more than 2 degrees, but there's 50% chance it will warm more than 2 degrees. So it's just in the middle. A carbon budget, mythically, with 50% for 2 degrees, has a 10% chance of getting to 4 degrees. Now, nobody will put their kids in a swimming pool or jump on a plane if there's a 0.1% risk of failure. I mean, if you said to somebody, you can fly to Europe, there's a 1 in 200 chance that you won't get there, nobody would get on the plane. If you can say, you can go out surfing today, there's a 1% chance a shark will get you, nobody will leave the beach. But we're talking about the risk of 33 and 50% chances of failure being at the core of these carbon budgets and the policy making that comes from it. So this is a catastrophic failure in risks. I mean, we don't say, oh, there's a 50% chance that somebody might knock off a nuclear weapon, but that's all right. So this is the really big problem, that we're not being risk averse when humanity is at stake, and we're not looking at the high-end possibilities, which are the ones that are tending to be coming true because the science has underestimated some systemic nonlinear processes. Sorry for the bad news, but this is the way it is.
It sounds like the marketing department has done a bloody good spin on how to present favourable news.
Yes, well, I mean, if you look at the IPCC, and particularly those international policy-making conferences we have each year, you know, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they meet. They're about to have one in Egypt. You know, there was the one in Glasgow, and then there was the famous ones at Paris and so on. I mean, they are politico-socio-science meetings. So there's this weird combination of science and politics. I mean, a really classic example is that everybody said, oh, let's keep warming to 2 degrees. This is our policy aspiration. So all the scientists produced all these papers about 2 degrees. Then at Paris in 2015, the Pacific Island states said, we think we should go for 1.5. But the scientists had never produced a body of work about 1.5 because it wasn't politically relevant. So this is the dance between science and politics. And if you said, what do you have to do to keep warming to 1 degree, nobody would say anything because no work's been done because it's not politically relevant.
Earlier this season, we interviewed Professor Greta Petzel, one of the lead authors of one of the IPCC papers, and it was for our region, Australasia. It was back episode 4. And one of the outcomes that she spoke about was the increase of certainty in the climate science findings. So we're even more certain of the repercussions. We're even more certain of where we're heading. Yet you talk about the growing gap between the science and politics.
Well, I think the gap's always been there. I don't think that things are becoming more uncertain. They're certainly not certain. I mean, in 2014, when a paper came out from Rigno et al. Saying we think these glaciers in West Antarctica have passed their tipping point, and we talked to him afterwards, and we said, when do you think this happened? And he said, when warming was 0.5, which was in the 1980s. When that paper came out in 2014, we interviewed leading scientists, one in Melbourne here, who said, we, the science community, are shocked by this outcome. We never thought this would happen so quickly. And that's the thing we keep on hearing. Oh, look, we thought coral reefs would be safe to 2 degrees. They've effectively been lost at 1 degree. Oh, we didn't think it would happen so quickly. So I'm not sure that we understand the risks better. I really don't. I mean, the other problem is, of course, that because we've wasted decades, the gap to act is getting shorter and shorter. And that exacerbates things as well, because you don't have the luxury of going slowly anymore.
So what do you think the main priority should be at the moment? It's my understanding that even if we stopped all emissions as of today, we'd still be tracking up past the 1.5 because of what we've already committed to.
Absolutely true.
So where do we need to put our focus? Is it mitigation, adaptation, drawdown? Like, do you have a priority here?
Tick all the boxes.
Yeah.
All of the above, please.
All of the above. Look, I mean, adaptation is necessary because people are going to have to change how and where they live and work. I mean, not just Pacific Island states. I mean, look at Pakistan, look at cyclones, look at people living on the Keys in West Florida. I mean, wherever you go, things are going to have to change. So we absolutely need to adapt. But there is an adaptation trap that if you spend all the money on adaptation and none on solving the problem, everybody will die. So that's the first thing to say. Adaptation is necessary, but it's a death knell if you don't do anything else. Do we have to stop using fossil fuels? Absolutely. People say to me, "You say there's no carbon budget. When should we stop using fossil fuels?" And I say yesterday, because we have we've run out of time. It should have been yesterday. And that's absolutely true. It should have been 10, 20 years ago. So there is no course of action which is not urgent enough. The second thing is that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now, if we just maintained at that level, would probably produce, looking at the long-term historical trend, about 3 degrees of warming and a sea level rise of 25 to 40 meters, which means it will be all over for most of humanity. You could go and read J.G. Ballard's book from the 1950s called The Drowning World about the Arctic, if you want to see the imagination of that. So there's absolutely too much up there, and we have to draw it down. We have to get it down. And there should be a large amount of time and effort working out, how to do it. Some of it we know. Some of it, the ideas are there and need to be scaled up. But it is a really important task to get that stuff down before it overwhelms us. And the third thing is that, and this is something that Sir David King, the former UK chief scientist, who now heads a thing called the Centre for Climate Repair at Cambridge, is looking at, he's saying we have to cool the Arctic really quickly or the system changes will get out of control and it will all be over. So he and others at Cambridge, at the Centre for Climate Repair, are looking at ways that you can really quickly now cool the Arctic to stop the sea ice disappearing, to stabilise Greenland. I mean, one of the things, everything's connected to everything else. And in the Arctic, the sea ice, as we talked about earlier, is decreasing. More heat's coming into the Arctic. The Arctic's warming at least 3 times faster than the global average. That's melting Greenland. As Greenland melts, a lot of fresh water gets poured into the North Atlantic, and that's contributing to a slowdown of what's called the Gulf Stream, the water that swooshes up, the large-scale circulation pattern in the Arctic, in the Atlantic, that carries warm water from the Caribbean up the American coast and into Europe. And if that slows down too much, Europe will freeze, even in a hotter world. The changes in the Gulf Stream are also contributing to less rain over eastern Antarctica. So, these systems, these dominoes do connect together and fall on each other. And so they're saying we need to find a way to cool and stabilise the Arctic system now. People can call it geoengineering, climate interventions, whatever you want to. It says if we don't have governments actually doing this in the next 5 years, I fear for the future of humanity. So stop emissions mitigation, processes to get the carbon levels in the atmosphere down to a point so we don't get to 3 degrees and 40 metres of sea level rise, and some interventions to try and stabilise really crucial systems now. I know that's a lot, but that's why, 15 years ago in Climate Code Red, we said this is an emergency. And by that we meant, we've all had floods and fires, a lot of floods recently. I was brought up on the north coast of New South Wales where every year the river flooded and people moved out of their low-level houses and the cows were moved to higher ground and we didn't go to school. And I thought about that, and there are circumstances in this society where we stop normal business. Fires, floods, even COVID. We closed down half an economy because of an overwhelming threat, which was COVID. We acted entirely differently and agreed to act differently in order to keep ourselves alive. And we think, and that was the basis of Climate Code Red, was called Climate Code Red, the case for emergency action. And back then it was saying we actually need to mobilise the whole society to do the things we've been talking about, making climate the number one priority of politics and economics. I mean, sooner or later that will happen, because if we don't, we're not going to make it. It's just that nobody wanted to listen for the first 10 years.
So our goals, I suppose, a UN goal for 2030, halving our emissions by 50%.
Yep.
Holding our warming to below 2 degrees, if possible. Is that still relevant? And if it is, how important is it?
Is it the right goal? No.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
No, it's not the right goal. I think we have to go for 2030. I mean, some capital cities and nations are doing it. I mean, we have no budget left. We need to stop doing this. How soon can you do it? Well, how long is a piece of string? How much effort do you want to put in to stop doing it? How disruptive, how much are you prepared to disrupt society in order to achieve that goal? And international policy making system says, no, we hate disruption. The economy, financial markets hate disruption. We want a smooth transition. Well, COVID didn't give us a smooth transition. The Ukrainians in February didn't get a smooth transition. We actually need to make this the number one priority, and it will be uncomfortable for a lot of people. Maybe we won't jump on planes and burn huge amounts of fuel to go to Bali for 2 weeks. Maybe we'll ban jet skis and a whole lot of things, and that's trivial, but so I don't think it's the right goal. Are we going to get there? Are we going to halve by 2030? The former head of the UNFCCC was at Climate Week in New York a few weeks ago. It's the big climate event of the year. It's associated when all the ambassadors go to the UN, and she gave a nighttime event, and this would have been full of policymakers and, the who's who of global policy making. And in front of this nighttime audience, she told this story on Twitter. She said, put up your hand if you think there's a reasonable chance of the world getting to 50% reduction by 2030. And she said on Twitter, not one person put up their hand. And I mean, the way it's going, we'll be lucky if emissions are 10% lower than by 2030. Because emissions year by year are still going up. People are still building new coal and gas energy systems. People are travelling more. It's called revenge travel. Couldn't travel during COVID, so now everybody's piling in. So, I mean, I'm not sure that emissions have even peaked yet, and we're about to get to 2023.
And I mean, talk to us about net zero anyway, because a lot of these plans have, these smart accounting tricks in them, carbon credits, carbon offsetting, etc. Like
drawdown.
Yeah. Well, look, we actually did a little briefing note last year about net zero 2050. It's on the Breakthrough website if people want to have a look at it. It's a fascinating topic, and it's a microcosm of the scam, I guess. So you've got this thing about net zero by 2050 for a 2-degree goal. So the first question, is the 2-degree goal appropriate? I would say not. I mean, what will save the world in Antarctica and coral reefs is getting back to under half a degree. So the goal's not appropriate. And then there's a question of the path, and they're saying net zero by 2050. So not no emissions. We'll keep on emitting, but we'll have other things that will offset the emissions. I mean, the thing about net zero 2050 is that the whole of the fossil fuel industry have signed up to it. Shell has signed up to it. And Shell says in their energy transition for 2021, they committed themselves to a total absolute emissions to net zero by 2050. And in the same report said, but we plan to increase our gas production and use nature-based offsets to justify it. So what they're saying is we'll still pump gas and people will burn it, and somewhere somebody will get some land and grow trees on it, and the trees will draw carbon out of the atmosphere, and then we're all hunky-dory. So, I mean, this is a scam. I mean, net zeros, the problems is it's deferring the problem to later on. Like what it's saying is we can burn fossil fuels for another 30 years, and it's saying, like, burn now, pay later, sort of thing. And it's also saying in the second half of the century, we'll get all these drawdown mechanisms going, which will offset the things that we've burnt between now and 2050. So it's like a credit card out of control. And then you end up bankrupt. It's it's a version of that when, as we know, it's the short term that matters most. So, I mean, the problem is deferring, and even within the idea of an offset is a very problematic thing. I mean, the most common form of offsets I think people think about are things like growing trees, revegetation. The problem with that is Shell burns gas today, you plant the trees, but it takes 40 years for them to draw down. So the drawdown's not immediate, it's over a long period of time. You plant trees in the Midwest of New South Wales, as they do, and the drought comes and all the trees die, then your offset's gone up in smoke. You have the schemes which has brought the current sort of carbon trading program in Australia into disrepute, and is now being reviewed by the new government, where farmers were paid to grow vegetation to offset these sorts of things. And then some people put up some satellites and found that half of where the vegetation was supposed to be grown, it hadn't. So it's a government or a carbon accounting measure. I mean, how do you know whether these trees have drawn it down or whether the trees were ever planted? So it's turning climate action into a market for carbon.
I feel like we need to name this segment the Idiot's Guide to Carbon Offsetting, because honestly, it's how can people not see beyond this? It's
because the market is concerned with monetizing a product. And it doesn't matter.
I want to buy a ticket to jump on a plane. I then scroll to the bottom. I get the option of, you can pay an extra $5 and offset your emissions.
Greenwashing.
100%. But
greenwashing.
It's everywhere. It's absolutely.
Yes, but that's because the market rules.
Yeah. The
market rules, and the great contradiction in the core of all of this, I think, is that the policy-making process, as we've talked about, is based on the assumption there can be a smooth, non-disruptive, market-driven process to save the world from being burnt by climate change. And I just don't think that's realistic. I mean, when you want to deal with any form of an emergency, look at COVID. Look at the degree of government intervention we had to actually solve the problem. The market didn't solve the problem. The state intervened and said, these are the things we have to do to come out the other end of this. When you've got a flood or a fire, you don't say, we'll have a market in fire trucks and all the fire trucks will line up at the edge of the fire, and then the lowest bidder will put their fire truck out to the market. No, the state develops, governments develop firefighting systems, flood mitigation systems. I mean, emergencies are best dealt with, in essence, by government planning in advance. And that's what we don't want to have the conversation about the role of government in the climate transition. We keep on wanting to, policymakers keep on wanting to think that if you set up a market in offsets, because a market is, everybody loves a market, Shell loves it, global finance loves it. Everybody loves a market. That will solve the problem, and I just don't think that's true. And that's the core of the contradiction.
And then I suppose it's also understanding the size of the actual problem. So a lot of people, they get the snapshot on the news, and it's through rose-colored glasses, and everything's hunky-dory, and they continue on with their life. And I mean, there's this ongoing argument within academia, even regarding the best way to communicate the climate emergency, the overstep of the planetary boundaries, how to live sustainably. And there seems to be like a back and forth between people leading with grounded hope and best possible scenarios if X, Y, Z is achieved. And then on the flip side, of course, there's a lot of people, many client scientists even that I follow, they seem to be dug into almost the doomerism camp.
Yes, indeed.
So, of course, good communication is about knowing your audience, and different values will resonate with different people. But to communicate this as effectively as possible to the wider community, to get more people understanding what's really going on, what do you consider the most effective way of shaping the narrative? Is it hope? Is it fear? Is it a mixture of the two, or something completely different?
Well, the science is sort of complex in a way, but so is medicine, and we sort of managed to get around that. Greta Thunberg didn't find the science too difficult. She got on top of it. She communicated it really well. So I don't think there's anything inherent. It's, one's willingness to actually decide whether you want to know whether your family's got a future or not. We can understand very complex things when we want to. Of course, it's complex. Many things are complex. Setting up a new iPhone can be complex for some people. When things crash. Look, obviously, I spent some time trying to think about how you communicate things effectively. I mean, I guess, we wrote a book, and I was trying to think about, because we wanted to, Climate Code Red said three things. The science is more severe than people think. I think that really turned out to be true. The second thing it says was 2 degrees is not a good target. It's got to be less. I think that's evidence has shown that if you've got tipping points at 1.1. And the third thing was we need a mobilisation like a war or an emergency to do it. Those are the three messages of the book. And I was trying to think about how, you communicate that, and it was going round and round in my head. And I suddenly thought about hospitals and what they do when somebody's about to die, and the bell goes off, and there's the thing in the hospital, there's a climate code red, and there's climate code blue and brown. And I thought, well, red's the best colour because red's heat. So I thought, let's call the book Climate Code Red. And that has become sort of a bit of after sitting there for 10 years, a bit of a global meme. The idea of climate emergency, that phrase which we codified in the book, sort of has become a real, partly through the work of Greta and Extinction Rebellion, has become a global meme. 2 or 3 years ago, 2 international dictionaries made it their word of the year because it was suddenly in. So, I think we can find ways to communicate through that sort of language that works. In terms of hope and fear, this is the eternal battle. What worries me about the hope people, and I think it's because of their own fear of dealing with the problem, they just want to be hopeful, is that hope is not a strategy. Go and talk to military people and ask them if hope's a strategy, and they say no. Go and talk to epidemiologists, is hope a strategy? They say no. The problem with doomism is that it disables people. In doomism, and that you see it more and more, and I really don't like it. There's no agency. There's just wallowing in personal bleakness, I think. And I think doomism often reflects a person's personal psychological makeup more than a rational analysis of the world. If you look at health promotion, whether it's AIDS or smoking or any of those sorts of things, it's sort of both. You think about the smoking ads, they say, smoking will kill you, doom, but you can stop and your lungs will repair quite quickly, hope. And the really big bit, here's a path from one to the other. This is going to kill you, stop smoking, you feel better, you need to ring the quit line. Or, in Australia a few years ago, they had a interesting campaign saying, just because you've given up once doesn't mean you can't. Every time you give up, you're closer to giving up forever. So we're sort of trying to find agency in people's lived experience in the struggle of giving up smoking. So that's the path is from fear or doom to hope with a pathway in between. So it's not one or the other. It's both. or you can say it's neither, and what it's really about is courage. So when people say to me, hope or fear, I go, nah, courage.
And using the cigarette or the smoking example, government intervention to encourage you to change by putting more tax on. So
public education, fiscal means, also a really complex range of things, taking smoking out off the opera and the sport, and universities, at least in Australia and other places, are smoke-free zones. Public, you use as many different things as you can to get to the outcome.
Yeah.
So should we have a carbon quit line? Ring us and we'll tell you how to reduce your carbon emissions.
Well, I mean, we are, because we are addicted to carbon. I mean, we've got an energy system which is largely carbon, and you can get out of that to some extent. It's very hard to buy a fridge or a lot of food that doesn't have a lot of carbon embedded, and then there's all that conspicuous consumption where people decide to jump on the big carbon machine in the sky and blow 10 tons by flying to London and back for somebody's wedding. So, I mean, some of it's difficult to grasp with, and some of it's just, idiotic.
Yeah. David, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show to just tell us how it is. And that's what we need. We need more of these honest conversations.
I thought you were going to say, I was going to use the word pleasure, but then I didn't think pleasure was quite the right word. But
maybe it's not. But
I'm glad you stuck with it. And I mean, the thing is that this society is capable of incredible change when it wants to. I mean, the pandemic thing was amazing. That people would go through quite a bit of discomfort and changing what they did, and it was tough, particularly for us in Melbourne who got locked down for almost a year altogether. But it was necessary, and one of the things people did a study of World War II and rationing, which we had here in England because things were short, and sociologists after the war sort of asked people, why did you accept all this rationing? And people said because it was necessary and it was fair to win the war. And I'm sure you could ask people in Ukraine the same thing. They'd say, we're going through some deprivation, but this is necessary and it's fair. And I think people would accept quite a bit of change into society and government, real leadership in public education and intervention, if they thought, I think they think it's necessary, but they don't think it's fair. If the elites said we're going to jump off our private jets and the pop stars, I think people would be encouraged to think that we're taking it seriously. So I think the society is capable when it wants to be in emergency mode of doing anything it wants to do, whether it's wars, whether it's pandemics, whether it's Ukraine or whatever. This can be done, so people should never think that we can't do it. We absolutely historically have had the capacity to do so.
But we all need to do it, and that's the difference. So, look, 2008 book, Climate Code Red, it just shows in 2022 it's even more relevant. It shows the need, even increased need for climate action, and the collective is something we go on about. We all need to jump on board. We all need to take it seriously. Because we can make a change, but it needs to happen now and it needs to happen fast. David, thank you so much for sharing your passion and your wisdom. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll say my pleasure too.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.